Hi everyone and welcome to Dance Podcast Season 3. I'm your host, Jasmine Cook. This is a dance science podcast presenting discussions with global industry leaders, aiming to make research and information more accessible and enhance dancer wellbeing, health and training at all levels of the sector. New episodes every Monday, 6 a.m. London time. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of Dance. I'm really excited for this one and I'm sure you all will be as well. I'm here today with Niall from the Royal Ballet School, who obviously did an episode in season 2, so definitely go and check that out if you haven't heard it already, but I'm sure you have because that one did really, really well. So I'm really excited to be back in today to pick some more ideas from him and learn a little bit more about how S&C works at White Lodge. Hi Niall and welcome back. How are you today?
How you doing? Yeah, good. What about yourself?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Just in case people haven't heard your first episode, can you just give us a little bit of intro to yourself, what you do, who you are?
Yeah, so I guess I'm like a sports scientist / strength and conditioning coach, or dance scientist maybe. It's a bit of a mixture of a lot of things. I was working mostly in sport prior to my role now. Obviously, why you're speaking to me is because I'm at the Royal Ballet School. So this is my 5th year at the Royal Ballet School. I primarily work at White Lodge, but obviously there's a fair bit of crossover all the way up. So White Lodge, for people who don't know, is students from 11 to 16. And I guess my particular interest is kind of growth and maturation. And I guess because of that, I've worked in a few other different things. So I'm doing a PhD part-time with St Mary's University that looks at maturation and the influence of that on elite pre-professional ballet dancers. And also, I'm also working part-time for England football with their age group teams as well, which obviously is a bit different. But yeah, so I guess that's my kind of area of interest.
Yeah, amazing, sure. And it is a bit different, but it kind of feeds in a little bit, I guess, which we'll get into a little bit later. So later today, we're going to focus, just so people kind of know what we're talking about today, on the long-term athlete development model, which I've touched on in a few episodes, but haven't really looked at. So we're going to look at how that fits into dance. But first, can you just tell us, so the process of starting S&C at White Lodge, so you kind of established this training system. I think you as a S&C team established this training system and program over the years. How was that introducing it? So how did you start to introduce it? How has it grown since?
Yeah, so where to start? Basically, so whenever I came into the school, there was already some provision at upper school. And to an extent there was some here, but I'll explain that a bit more. So effectively, Adam, who I know you've had on, Matusi, he was also part-time at the upper school at the time, and he'd obviously also been involved with setting up at the company. So I guess upper school the whole school as in general wanted to invest a bit more in dancer health, and so they had the example of the company, so they kind of incorporated it here as well. So that had started. I think they'd done about a year or so at the upper school already, so there was a little bit of provision in there. And then with White Lodge, I guess I was employed to kind of try and start that at the school. Originally that was on 2 days a week, so there wasn't a lot of time. So some of the sort of systems we've got now were based on having to be flexible, like whenever I started. So there was me, but I was lucky enough when I arrived that there was Erin Bowerman was there, who was a Pilates instructor, but her background was actually more in sports science. So she was kind of like half S&C, half Pilates. And so she was already doing some sessions for the students and things like that. So really it was more about, I don't know how similar the school is to other dance environments, but it's a very rushed, like a very crammed schedule, and how do you make time to allow people to get kind of more consistent adaptations. So that's kind of was the first thing, was trying to get a model together that was something that we could aim for, that could be delivered with various part-time staff but still communicate effectively, so we're not all doing the same thing or missing bits, that could then be delivered across all the age groups, that kind of builds them up and hopefully increases a bit of kind of robustness as they go up through the school. So I say now this is my 5th year. I'm full-time. I've been full-time for a couple of years now. And yeah, so it has been much more integrated into the school. I would think that the students would consider it as part of their training. I'd say it is a relatively normal thing. Different year groups have different sessions. Like we can go into more details around that if necessary, but like most of them will have an idea of how to do it. Of how to do S&C, and I would say it's kind of much more of a part of the school than when I started. I don't know. I've got about the houses a bit there, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. I was going to ask, so where did you start? So the upper school had a program already. Did you start with year 7 and then pull it up through them? Or did you kind of start with a program every year? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so there was certain things that were already built into the timetable, like there was a kind of upper body session for the boys, year 10 and 11, obviously to prepare them for pas de deux. So there are things like that I could just like first week start doing stuff. But I quickly realized that wouldn't really be enough, really. I mean, because you have these kind of quite old weights, and we were all doing it in the studio. And particularly if you're going to have not many sessions, you need to hit a certain volume or a certain intensity to get the adaptions that you want. So it's just very difficult in that sort of environment to progress them and to hit the right intensity and do it safely and all the rest of it. So there was certain things like that were already in place. How it kind of worked out at the time was generally Erin or potentially one of the videos would take students out of class. And then they would normally see them for a few weeks to work on a specific thing. So say if it was like turnout, they would do turnout exercises for a time period, or they would just set them turnout exercises that the students would try and find time to do themselves. But again, I think that would probably be a theme of what I talk about, is that you need to hit a certain intensity. And really, if you want to do that properly, you need supervision and you need to be pushed, I guess, particularly if you're not going to do it very much. And the problem with like the students are amazing in terms of their dedication. Like a lot of them would do it, but obviously if you leave them to do it yourselves, their technique could go all over the place. If they're rushed, they won't do it. You need to build the time in to have it actually integrated into the system. So that was basically, I started with the sessions that there were already. And then we effectively, as a healthcare team, not just with myself, thought of a program across all the year groups that we wanted to try and deliver, and how to fit it into the timetable. And then I presented that to the healthcare team, and then to the artistic team, to the artistic kind of director of the school, and then to the artistic team of kind of, this is the way we're going with it, which was simply, it was to have a session every week of either Pilates or S&C that was individual for every student. So so effectively at the time, it's changed a tiny bit now, but at the time I was very conscious of taking people out of class. Was basically the only time to do it, because their academic schedule is also quite demanding. So effectively they have dance for 4 hours and academics for 4 hours, and then breaks and stuff like that. There's no actual time to deliver outside of that. So effectively the only way to do it was to take people out of ballet class. The way that was done to try and make it like not impact the class as much as possible was that effectively, say if you have the 10s and 11s do their classes at the same time, and there's 4 classes because there's girls and boys across those 2 year groups. So what we did originally is, within our sort of Pilates studio and sort of gym area, we could probably fit about 8 people. So we would pick 2 people from each one, or 2 or 3 people from each class, so that the class itself is not massively affected, but that then there's enough people in the session so that then you can kind of do individual sessions for everyone. Does that make sense? So so we would kind of take them all out, and then they'd all have their own programs. So that was the kind of first way it was integrated, and that would either be me or I think there's a brief period with Erin running it, and now the Pilates instructor who's here now, Markella, then she would run those as well. And we used to, it was, to be honest, the most complicated thing about it was probably the timetabling, because there would always be something where like someone can't miss this rehearsal, or someone can't do this, or there's a guest person here, or they're watching this class, or so it was just trying to coordinate all of those different things. And so, yeah, that was, and also every week I would change what time it was, so they wouldn't always miss the same bit of class. Luckily, it's a bit more steady now, so we've lost a bit of that. But that was effectively right at the beginning. I just had to be as flexible as I possibly could. But it comes back to your principles, which are you have to train at a certain volume and intensity to get a response, particularly if there isn't overall much volume. Like if you're going to do one session a week, then it has to be a pretty good session to get something back off it. And secondly, you need consistency to develop. So without consistency, it's pointless. You know, like anyone who has done a New Year's resolution and gone to the gym for 3 or 4 weeks and then been like, oh, I'm feeling pretty good, and then dropped off it, will know that like it's actually about what you do over quite a long period of time that sees the results. So so that was the way it was kind of first introduced, I guess. But the idea of having rather than just focusing on 1 year group, the idea of having a long-term model that was built towards being a professional dancer was always factored in right from the start.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love what you said about how they just consider it as part of their training now. So when they come in, they just have S&C and that's just part of their schedule now. I think that's like... Yeah,
I think it has developed a lot. Like it's been really helpful because now, for example, obviously I started 5 years ago. The year 11s now started at the same time as me.
Yeah.
So when the younger kids come in, they see the older years doing it. And obviously every year they get a bit better and they get a bit more confident. And it's not like when I started, it was quite a weird thing to do. And people are much more skeptical. Whereas even now, you know, not just because like of my role in the school, but because of it's much more visible. It's all over social media. There's other practitioners out there and stuff like that. I just feel like it's much more normal now. And the younger students have almost like role models. And so they want to push themselves up to be as good as the year 11s or whatever it is, you know?
Yeah, I think that's such a positive shift. So looking at that now, how does the program now work from year 7 upwards? So what's kind of the progression through the years? How do you track that progression? What are they aiming to improve upon each year? So does it increase in like volume or is it just in intensity? Or
yeah, I probably go quite full on with this, so you can edit out any bits that aren't as useful. Effectively, the idea of our model for healthcare is like an ABC model. So the A is availability. So that is the most, well, probably the biggest point of S&C is probably the most beneficial thing of S&C, and it's potentially one of our bigger outcomes, because obviously if we get more dancers in class more often, doing class less restricted, and they're going to get more and more teaching, and hopefully that they'll become better as a byproduct of that anyway. Okay, and they'll hopefully then be able to achieve whatever their aims are, whether it's, you know, the Royal Opera House or another company or contemporary dance or whatever it is. So that's the kind of the bottom line, is to try and reduce injuries. So that's one of our kind of outcomes, if you like. The second one is B, which is better, which is trying to make the dancers better, obviously. To do that, there was a lot of like consultation, but effectively it's focused over certain things. So they are turnout, I'm trying to which order to do this, jumping and landing. There's obviously upper body for the boys for pas de deux. There's kind of basic trunk and posture. And then there's like point and footwork. I'm trying to think if I missed anything. I think that's everything. Oh no, the other one, leg lifts. Okay, so leg lifts is a very vague term, but like anything. So like an arabesque, we would count under the same thing. Okay, so they're like better outcomes. That's a lot more complicated in terms of improving it. And part of what the kind of stage we're at now is really like getting into some of those things and trying to investigate, you know, what underpins that. Well, how do you do a turnout program for one person that's effective, and, you know, how do you modify that for the next person, because obviously each dancer is different in that case. So that's our kind of main outcomes. From S&C perspective. The C is coping, so that is more from a mental health perspective. So that the objectives of us, like our clinical psychologists and our counsellors, and to an extent the nurses. So everyone kind of feeds into all of it. Everyone knows everyone else's objectives, but obviously from an S&C perspective, I'm primarily focused on the more physical things. Like physical development is my thing. Okay, so the one is, I guess, developing robustness, and secondly is can we make them a bit better. So yeah, so that's kind of that. Then when you start at if you start at year 7, the way we do that is primarily through games. So I know you had Rob on from Priya Ballet who talks a bit about that. Obviously there's loads of stuff out there in kind of youth S&C community about different ideas, but we also, actually I'll get onto that bit later, but say for example we're trying to improve jumping and landing, we might do something like with the year 7s, which is, it's one of our objectives, but it's also a massive one for the teachers, like alignment on landing and things like that. So we might do something like kind of what's the time, Mr. Wolf? So they'd be at the back of the room, and you would say like 2, say, and then they have 2 jumps, and if they lose their alignment or they lose their balance or something like that, then you send them to the back, and they have to try and get to a certain point. So the idea is that you're almost like constraining the drill, that it pushes intensity, which is what we want, because obviously they're trying to jump as far as they can, but also they keep the quality because otherwise they fail. So it's a kind of game, which was really important. So from the year 7s and to an extent the year 8s, it's really important that they enjoy it, because we want, like I was very conscious of that when I came in, that, you know, I wasn't that experienced in ballet at all, but if you watch a ballet class, it's incredibly disciplined and very serious, and you know what I mean, it's pretty everything's business. So if you start with the year 7s, what I wanted was that S&C was a bit more, their physical development was a bit more of a like relaxing environment, because I think, like, I mean, this is anecdotal really, but my experience is that things that you kind of enjoy when you're a child, you keep that feeling even if it gets more serious to an extent when you get older. So I wanted, at least from that perspective, it to be a bit more of a mental release, because, you know, it's a hugely high pressure environment here, as you can imagine. I mean, the kids are, you know, they're good kids and they're enjoying themselves sort of thing, but it's very, very competitive. You have to be on it kind of every class. So you want to give them ways to escape that as well. So yeah, so primarily it's done through games basically when you're in year 7. And then as you progress up the school, it becomes a little bit more formalized. So yeah, and that's kind of changed a little bit throughout the years. So we probably spend more time on like body weight exercises and things like that with year 8s. And we used to spend a lot more with year 9s, but to be honest, because they're doing so well now with year 8s, we're starting moving them straight into like squats and things like, you know, back squats, even now as year 8s. And then, yeah, but then that just progresses. So there's the kind of 2 things. One is they have to basically understand the technique. So, and you want to develop technique. So an example might be, you might start with, say if you've got a deadlift, you might start with like a pull through or something like that, if people know what it is, or they can look it up. It's basically like, whether year 7s, we start with literally a hinge. So you just hinge forward to come back up. Then you go like year 8s, you do a pull through where you've got like a band and you have to try and pull through. Year 9s, you might start bringing in like a rack pull, which is like a deadlift, but obviously not as far down. And then year 9, or like year 9/10, you start bringing in like full on deadlifts. And so you kind of progress it up that way. But at the same time, there is a need to prepare them for now. I mean, the school's a little bit different now that there's less periods, but it used to be before that potentially every year you could be assessed out. So it's no good saying, oh, I've spent all this time and look at their perfect technique, if they need to get strong and robust enough to deal with that year and hopefully pass those assessments. So you still need to have what they're doing now is hard enough for them, whilst building in those like layers of technique, I guess. And to do that, there's kind of different methods to do that. So that's runs throughout the school. As they get towards there's loads of different things as well from a Pilates perspective as well, but I'll probably leave that because it's not as much my area. And then as they get up to year 10 and 11, they still have those group classes. But there's a little bit more like autonomy generally about, and a bit more education around what they need to do. And kind of, so for an example might be, obviously once they go into year 11, they start doing quite serious auditions and things like that. we've done ones that are kind of educating them around mobility around certain joints, say talks, and then we progress that to, okay, so if you're doing a warm-up, what do you need in a warm-up and when would you need to warm up? And they're allowed to like ask different questions. And then we've like built them, I guess, like audition warm-ups. So if you needed to lift your legs higher, for example, how would you build a warm-up around that? So then you go into the audition and you're straight away ready on the bar. So there's kind of like education things a little bit more as they get older to try and like help them, because obviously once the kids leave the school, they wouldn't necessarily go into a formalized S&C program. So you've got to have them understand the kind of pros and cons and what they're trying to work on. So yeah, they get a bit more of that. And effectively they get, like the girls get a foot and ankle extra session, which they all do a week. The boys do an upper body every week. They all get a recovery, and then we do like an eccentric or isometric thing on a Friday. Depending on the week. But still, and then their individual programs, effectively what we'll do with those is if for example, that deadlift example I gave you earlier. So we have everything built into SmarterBase. So we use SmarterBase like an online database. So when you enter an exercise, it will come up with like a deadlift level 1, say. So like a pull through might be like a deadlift level 1. Their level 2 might be a rack pull, and a proper deadlift would be a level 3. So that's all built in to the system. So that's like formalized. So we have within that, all of those are categorized again. So we'd have like force development exercises, which are those type of things like deadlifts, squats, etc. We'll have isolated development exercises, which are more things like ankle specific work. So like calf rises or calf mobility would all be under, there's like level 1, 2, and 3 for that as well. And then we would have or foot exercises, and then we'd have fundamental movement skills, which are just kind of, obviously that's something that people generally talk about in a sporting context, but they're still relatively ballet specific in that we use jumping and landing, trunk and posture that I mentioned before, and the other one's balance. So, and again, they are categorized level 1, 2, and 3. So you're always trying to kind of move through the levels, but make sure that the levels are like hard enough for what they're doing now. So that's kind of how we're like progressing that. That will all be captured by SmarterBase, and you'll be able to kind of review. So every dancer needs to have, like everyone in the year group needs to have done, say, all their level 1s of whatever it is by the end of year 8. But some of them might need more work on something. So some of them might need more turnout work. So I guess the percentage of distribution of that they've spent of time on different things would be different depending on what they need for that time.
That's great, because I think even though it's in depth, I'm still following, and I love to hear about it. And I think that it shows how important it is as well. Like I think the fact that it's so like the SmarterBase that you use and everything like that, I think it really shows that it's such like a key factor in their training, and it's something that's worth tracking. And I hope it shows the importance to people who are listening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I guess I know you asked about intensity and volume.
Yeah.
Like the volume by itself will go up because they're doing more when they get to year 10 and 11, and also volume will also go up as a consequence of the intensity going up. So like if they're lifting heavier weights, the volume will increase. But generally speaking, we always want a relatively high intensity and a relatively low volume, I guess. So that is that's pretty consistent all the way through. Obviously, when people are less trained, you need to maybe go for a bit more volume because they aren't trained enough to lift, whatever it is over their body weight on squats. You just can't do it. So you need to, there's more of a technique element, and you need to maybe introduce a bit more volume to, it's almost like a teaching tool as well. And then the more trained they get, then they would go up to more like, 4 sets of 3 or whatever it is on like heavy stuff. But that's generally the approach you'd take.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So looking at that then, obviously building it up from the foundations and then building on that through the years. So if you're looking at, so your training dancers, they go from year 7 all the way up. And at the kind of base of that at year 7, they've got quite a lot of general conditioning. And then you've obviously got the pressure that they're in it for ballet. So it needs to be somewhat training so that they improve in ballet. So specificity is a factor there. Can you tell us about that within the school?
Yeah, so I think specificity is one of those things that is often misinterpreted. Well, it depends who you're speaking to, I suppose, but I think it's misinterpreted within a dance context that I've experienced. So, so I mean, one of the things to say is that the specificity, like you would want more general training generally at a younger age. So that is all of their training. So that wouldn't be just S&C. Like if you want them to be more rounded, then they maybe need to do more activities than just dancing. Obviously, somewhere here that is more difficult because they're at obviously they're at quite a high level and they need to get the technical competency to progress through the school. So there's kind of pressure straight away, basically, even when you're year 7. In terms of like specificity for dance, I guess it's probably helpful to go through specificity itself. So, so one of the things is, I guess you've got I guess like capacity to an extent versus specificity. So it's important to know you're not always trying to get specificity per se, because there's more general like tissue adaptations that you want to get. There's almost like capacity, training for capacity and training like in a very specific way. From my perspective, there's like general tissue adaptations that you want to get that require a level of generality to get those adaptations. And like the specific stuff happens in class every day. So you're never going to get something that's purely dance specific as the dance itself. So if you've got one session, but you are not going to get stuff within dance that's going to push those capacities that you need that would underpin dance and particularly underpin robustness. So an example, obviously all tissues are going through a kind of regeneration process, and you want to, for example, a heavy load training might increase the response of bone, for example, to regenerate, to increase bone density, for example, which then might limit some of the injuries you might get. I guess that's the theory behind it. To do that, then you have to have a capacity. You have to be training a certain capacity, which obviously isn't possible if you're doing, I don't know, very specific balletic moves. In terms of like specificity itself, so I generally say I'm more worried about capacity, which is there has to be an element of specificity, but it's not completely specific. Okay, so in terms of like specificity itself, because this is one when we get students in from, because we have placement students from Trinity, Laban generally, or St Mary's, they don't generally understand this. So one of the things that was was taught on my masters quite heavily, particularly by Daniel Cleaver, who ran the masters when I was doing it. And if you want to look it up, he has some good resources either on Twitter or his book, is dynamic correspondence. So dynamic correspondence is a principle that is from Mel Sif and Verkhoshansky in super training. Effectively, it gives you different factors to judge specificity against something. And I'll try and pull this back to ballet once I've gone, because this is very theoretical. Okay, so one of them is the amplitude and the direction of movement. That's generally the one people focus on a lot. Like, does it look similar? Even though that's not always what makes it more specific. So one example might be a plie and a squat. The amplitude and the direction are relatively similar. Okay, cool. The next one is the region of accentuated force production. So that is, where is the force production demands within that exercise? So an example from that might be, say, if you're throwing someone versus bench press. So if or throwing something. So so I throw something, I keep accelerating until I've let the object go. Whereas if I do a bench press, there's a difficult the most difficult portion is towards the bottom. Okay, so there's a region of where the force production is greatest that is also specific to a certain skill. Okay, and obviously within that, you have to be focused on the other things, like it has to be the same muscle group. Okay, so the dynamics of the effort. Okay, so that is what I was talking about in terms of intensity. So are the dynamics of the effort in the exercise you've got greater than that are required in the skill that you're doing? Okay, so if I need to, again, like obviously a squat is a good example. If I put weight on a squat, the effort is more than if I just did a plie without weight. Do you see what I mean? For whatever I'm trying to work on. Of the next one, rate and time of the force production available. So again, people would say, like, I don't know, a jump versus a squat, they're obviously different time and rate. There might also be more of an element of like the stretch shortening cycle or something like that, which comes on to the second one, which is the regime of muscular work. So that is like, how does that process start and end, I guess? So an example, it might be like a jump where if I just jump from nothing, or if I'm like rebounding into a jump, the dynamic effort is different, and then also a lot of the other things like the rate and time available to produce the force is different, etc., etc. Okay, so they're following along with that. So nothing will have completely everything perfect unless you're doing the skill itself. So nothing will be truly specific apart from the skill itself. So what you really need to then work out is, where is the person deficient in the skill, and then how do I overload that bit of it in the most specific way? So an example might be, say it's a certain Allegro type activity, and the rebound portion of it, let's just say the kind of faster steps are where they're struggling, right? In that case, I need to do something that overloads maybe the stretch shortening cycle to deliver their ability to then move faster through those steps, to then jump higher or whatever it is, or turn faster. Okay, but I don't need to do that turn with a weight on, or do that turn on do you know what I mean? Because actually I need to still get the intensity that I need to improve that capacity, which all then is like a part of the skill. So it's like I don't know, it's like the way I've phrased it to the teachers is like, imagine that your dancer is kind of like house, if you like. We're trying to give you the products to build the house. So we're trying to get good quality things that then you can train people with, rather than trying to do the house as well, because there's no point me trying to sit there and go, all right, this is how you do a plie, when I've got all these really experienced ballet teachers who can do that in no time. What I need to do is improve their capacity so that learning it is easier, and they're not limited by that. They can just take on the information. And on top of that, I also need to stress the tissues enough to get build robustness.
What was that called again, that whole model? I've never heard that explained like that.
Dynamic correspondence.
No, that makes a lot of sense, because all I've ever really seen from specificity, and I think it's quite a shallow understanding that I have at the moment, is that basically you can't just do the same step over and over and expect it to improve. But I think the way you've broken it, like the way you've broken it down, the model breaks it down into all those different sections, that makes a lot of sense. That, and the house, that really, really makes sense. That's great.
Yeah, you don't have to go, like, how the hell do I make this ballet specific? If people don't have any training experience, they're going to get quite a lot of improvements from just generally increasing their strength. Right. So you don't have to be that specific to begin with. And that's probably what you see across the school, is that maybe there's a little bit more of a specificity around a certain dancer, in terms of like, maybe they need more mobility in this position, so they do more exercises on that specific thing as they get older, whereas generally when they're younger, they just need increase in general capacity kind of all over, I suppose.
Yeah, I think increasing capacity. Oh, just that makes a lot of sense to me. I love that. I'm going to go and look that up afterwards. I'm really
Okay.
looking into
Yeah, it's definitely worth looking it up after my explanation, I'd say.
it. No, not at all, not at all. Yeah. So the kind of like last like main area to look at today is something that I don't know. There's a whole podcast on this, so obviously we won't cover it in one episode. Like I'm pretty sure someone has a podcast for this, but long-term athlete development models. So there's so many factors in this and so many different kind of areas, but what are the key parts of it to consider in training dancers?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of how our model, obviously I spoke about it a fair bit earlier, it's just trying to make sure that they're kind of consistently moving towards something. So, I mean, that is basically periodization generally, it's just planning. Okay, so it's, for example, I will do very easy squat type exercises in the warm-ups for the year sevens and stuff, which are a bit more technique focused. They'll then do in year 8, when they start doing their individual sessions, they might do a bit more, like they will do overhead squats with like, they kind of use like plastic weights, but they can get up to quite heavy. So they could go up to 20 kilograms, say. And then when they progress from that, then we start going on to using an actual bar. But again, it's very technique focused. So one of the things I would do is get them to pause for 2 or 3 seconds at the bottom and then come back up just to like hammer home the position they need to be in to keep your stability at the bottom and to get far enough down. And then year 9, you can start loading it then. So it's more like you're effectively building over the years an idea so that then for when they need to stress it, they stress it. But having said that, obviously that was quite technique focused. So that would be something we would do for a squat. They still need to get stronger and not just from what their normal maturations. We need to still push their strength and test their strength anyway in every session anyway. So like the year 8s wouldn't just do that, even though they are allowed to progress that up to a bit heavier. They'd also do like single leg squats, for example, which is kind of like, I always use that as a bit of a base anyway, of like, if you can do a kind of single leg pistol squat type thing down to a small box and come back up. Like that's just, everyone has to go through that and try and keep their alignment, which is just something that just demands a certain level of capacity to be able to do it well. So it's not that this session is completely light session, it's not. So there's the technique element to try and build it up the school, but also all the time you have to be progressing that person to try and, obviously get to their potential. So I'm not sure that's necessarily explained long-term athlete development, or we would call it obviously long-term dancer development. But it's effectively making sure that there's a plan in the long term, but that they still are able to do what they need to do in the short term, and progress that all the way up to school. And now have had a bit more time, we've had more years, we also have kind of like measures that we look for, in terms of, we obviously do profiling, stuff like that. So we would have like jump height and kind of idea of where we want the dancers to be at a certain stage. And that's not just taken in consideration of the year that they're in, but also their maturation status, which obviously we have as well. So you kind of know, this person their biological age might be 13, but they're actually 14. And someone else in the same year might be biological age of 16, but actually 14. Or they actually need to be still pushed, even though they're an earlier developer, and vice versa. Do you see what I mean? So it's just so you kind of understand where people are at, where they need to progress to. And I guess it's really just having a plan.
Yeah, you spoke a bit about biological age in the other podcast, I think, if people want to go and listen to that. But I was going to just pick out, so you said, obviously, the biggest thing which you've said is that there is like long-term development that they're working towards, but you have got those goals like every year with their assessments and things, that it has to kind of be short-term as well. And that's a really tricky balance to get, I guess, right? Like,
it is. That is the tricky thing to get. And I think that's one of the things I see a lot of. I see a lot of where people have like populations that aren't very experienced, say, that they'll be like, right, well, we'll just work on all the technique, and we're just doing technique. Technique underpins everything, and I agree that is true to an extent. But you also, I think, like, this is just completely my personal philosophy, they also need to be pushed in terms of what they can do in every session. You want to improve them in that period of time, not just wait so that I can train them really well when they're 60. Do you know what I mean? Particularly within dance, where the levels of training you get to are very high from when you're very young.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess, that is your personal view, but it's also kind of put on it in dance if you're in a school when you have got to meet those goals at the end of each year. The last thing I was gonna ask was a bit of insight into how that kind of factor plays out at Royal, but I think you've kind of answered it. Yeah, that's great. So the last thing to kind of ask would be, this has obviously been going for a little while now at Royal, you've been there for 5 years. How do you kind of know that the kids are improving? So how do you track their improvement? How can you prove, I guess, in the research that what you're doing in practice is making a difference and this is the way to do it?
Yeah, so it's pretty difficult to conclusively prove anything. But what we measure are those things around the kind of A's and B's, I guess. So availability, which is effectively we look at the time, the days affected from dance. So we can monitor that every term and every year. So and we've seen that go down quite a lot in the last 5 years, which is obviously beneficial. Within that, there's more specific things that we look at. But for example, I talked a lot about the last podcast about hospital letters. So you might look at how specifically that has been managed, because that's a specific problem. In terms of better, although it plays into availability a little bit, we will look at jump height. So we measure that on force plates as just a broad measure of how high they're jumping. And also we do various screening tests. So one is we do single leg isometric calf, plantar flexion, or calf strength. And then we'll do a single leg isometric squat with most years groups. With all of those measures, we'll look at smallest worthwhile change, and then look at that across time to see if we're going above it. And then there's also kind of more specific projects, for example, Charlotte Williamson, who's the physio, is doing a project on turnout for her masters, which is just looking at how you measure turnout and then what changes, what doesn't change. So for those ones that are a little bit more ballet specific and then maybe isn't as much research out there, we're just trying to investigate how to do that. Then within that, we'll have review. We are kind of, like I said, split up into physical health, mental health and physical development. So then within each team, you'll have almost a termly review, and then that comes together for at the end of term, where you go through, okay, well, we're doing this, what do we need to do as a group to make this better or make it more efficient, or what went well, what do we need to keep, or stuff like that. So we'll go through stuff like that. Within that, from a physical development perspective, we would also look at the categories that I talked to you about before. So you can look at how much delivery we've had. And one of the things that I kind of didn't mention is those categories, even though I explain it with a S&C lens, Pilates is built into it as well. So if I maybe do a jumping and landing exercise, I might have a jumping and landing exercise from S&C might be, say, a box jump. Whereas from Pilates, it might be something on the reformer. And then when the more you weight it on the reformer, it becomes higher intensity or single leg. Do you see what I mean? It moves up the categories. So we can see overall what we've done, but it's not that we don't necessarily repeat each other's work, if that makes sense. Just so that we can have a consistent theme for what we're trying to improve across both Pilates and S&C, which is what we would call physical development here. So yeah, I think that's basically what we review. And and we have seen changes above smallest worthwhile change all the way across the school, and we've also seen changes in injuries. So that's kind of the main way we look at it. But always trying to get better.
Yeah, definitely. Just one more thing that I just thought of then. So you talked a lot, obviously you focus on physical development, and they're the things that you track. So when you're talking about your ABC, the coping sort of aspect is one that you look at less. But I was just going to ask, since you've introduced kind of S&C, have you noticed any impact on their mental health as well as as a result of the S&C? Does that make sense? If they can feel themselves getting stronger and they're working on it in that way, do you think that translates across to, say, confidence or mental well-being as well? Do you think there's a link between the two?
Yeah, it's difficult for me to say. So they do measure, they do have also outcomes from a mental health perspective. I don't want to go into it because I don't know it as well. So, but like, I do think there is, I mean, obviously I try to make it there an element because you'll try and be, like I say, I'll try and make it relatively fun. And I hope that I'm engaged with the students and trying to make them push themselves. And whenever they do the well, I'm obviously very enthusiastic. I always think, well, it's one of these things that people say, isn't it? That if they see you once a week, they only see you that once a week, you need to always be on it every time you see them. You want to always bring the enthusiasm to them, because if I've done 6 hours of academics and dancing that day and I turn up to S&C at 5 o'clock, you need to have a bit of energy to get them going. So obviously you try and make it from that perspective. And I think because of that, you get into maybe a relatively good relationship with the students, which is good. And it just like generally helps to that healthcare's place within the school is quite it's obviously there is also a pastoral element to the school, but it's still quite kind of nurturing. I feel like the students can use it a little bit more, not just in the actual mental health services, but like generally speaking. The other thing, and I guess the teachers have told me about this as well, is that I think it makes you more confident. Like if you can, I don't know, squat over your own body weight or jump into a certain height or anything like that, that there is some confidence in that, which hopefully would translate to dance, where they feel like they can maybe take on a more advanced step or whatever it is, because they know that they've got the physical competency to do it. And like I've had some good feedback on that from balletic staff as well. So that's quite nice. So I think that side of things does help. Hopefully it does help, but I don't have anything concrete to say that it definitely does.
No, yeah, that's what I was like kind of hoping you'd say, I guess, not with the leading questions or anything, but development in like physical development would kind of translate to confidence, which is really great to hear. Is there anything else you want to mention or discuss today, Niall?
I would just say with the like as you were just saying about the physical health and confidence, I guess it's also important that it's the nature of dance is that there is a lot of body confidence issues are a thing. You don't want to hide away from that is a thing within dance generally. And so in some ways being physically strong and stuff is quite nice from that perspective, and like encouraging what people can do with their body, kind of the amazing talent they have. S&C gives you a good platform to help with that, I would say, which is I think is beneficial from that perspective as well. It's just I think it's more in line with kind of the wider society, I would guess.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like a really positive focus, I guess, because that's probably what like dance should be like. It's like a positive focus on what your body can do, as opposed to thinking. But yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that's a really, really nice note to end on. Thank you so much for your time again today, Niall. As always, I really appreciate it, and I'm really grateful.
Okay. Yeah, no worries.
Thank you.
All good. Cheers.
See you later. Bye.
See you later. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Tune in again next Monday. And in the meantime, follow @SideDancePodcast on Instagram. It would also be so appreciated if you have a moment, if you could please rate and review on Apple to help the podcast grow. Bye.